Mysteries abound where most we seek for answers. Ray Bradbury. Welcome to this week's episode of Warfare, Advancement, Revisionism. My name is Preston Floyd, and as always, I'm your host. I'd like to thank you all for joining me this week. I appreciate this support. If you're a newcomer, welcome. I hope you'll peruse our backlog of episodes, and if you're a returning listener, once again, thank you all for your continued support. It means a lot. So please rate, review, download, subscribe, like, rate 5 stars, whatever you got to do on your platform of choice to support your creator. I would appreciate it if you would do so. Today, we will be continuing and possibly finishing our broad overview of the Danubian Neolithic / Danubian culture / Danubian protoculture between the years of 6 and 4000 BC, BCE, whichever you prefer. Before that, though, I did have a couple of things I wanted to discuss in regards to last week's episode, all related to the potential proto-script employed by the Vinca culture. First, I wanted to read the exact quote from Colin Renfrew, wherein he explained the similarities between symbols don't necessarily mean that they were copied or were forged. I paraphrased his example about the similarities between the Vinca goat and the Sumerian goat, but I just wanted to read the full quote because I think it'll help kind of explain what I want to talk about. To me, the comparison made between the signs of the Tataria tablets and those of Proto-Literate Sumeria carry very little weight. They are all simple pictographs, and a sign for a goat in one culture is bound to look much like the sign for a goat in another culture. To call these Balkan signs writing is perhaps to imply that they had an independent significance of their own communication to another person without oral contact. This I doubt. Now, that also touches on the claim that this is proto-writing, or that this was proto-writing. Now, I share Renfrew's belief and analysis, and I don't think that this was proto-writing. However, I did forget to mention some other theories on what said symbols, if they aren't forgeries, may be. And I think that is important to mention. Some have put forward the idea that some of the tablets may have been small rudimentary maps showing relative distance and directions between places. Not so much difference, but more directions. But there could have been distance involved there as well. With the symbols maybe being settlements or a settlement, and being near other symbols being sources of water or other resources. It's also possible that they were very similar to early Chinese pictographs, where some were merely ceremonial and meant to represent a natural or supernatural phenomenon upon which an individual may draw power and knowledge, and not as a means of record keeping in communication. Of course, now Chinese characters would evolve to do that, but the Vinca ones never did. They never had that chance. Also, another factor that may contribute to the similarities of symbols is that they all evolved from earlier Stone Age symbols that were present all over the world, specifically the Old World. I mentioned a book I read a while ago. I forget which episode it was when I talked about it, but it was called The First Signs. That's like the first part of the name. It's got a longer title than that. But if you search The First Signs by Genevieve von Petzinger, you'll get a better idea of what I'm talking about. But it's a very good book, and I do recommend it. And I've talked about it in the past. But there is a lot of overlap of hunter-gatherer symbols between Africa, Asia, and Europe. They share a lot of similar signs. So, that could be another reason why the signs are so similar. They evolved from similar first signs. Or, maybe they were just elaborate forgeries. We can't really say quite yet at this point. Although I will say there were some of the symbols found on those tablets, or at least similar symbols to those found on the tablets at other sites, aside from the Tataria tablets, that hints that, maybe they are more legitimate than some people claim. though again, there's not exactly a one-to-one, and not all of the symbols found on the Tartaria tablets have been found in other locations. So make of that what you will. Now, we're going to begin to move on to the new material. And this week we'll be covering the upper stretches of the Danube, and depending on timing, we will begin then to talk about several late Neolithic / early Chalcolithic cultures, that emerged in the area and the area that we talked about last week. So essentially, we may be finishing up on the Danubian culture this week. We may not. We may have like a small section next week to finish up on those. But we're going to go ahead and dive into it and see how much we can get through today. We will begin with the Linear Pottery Culture. Now, this culture will last in some areas as long as 1,000 years, give or take a century or two. And eventually, it will become extremely widespread over the course of this season. It will cover parts of Czechia / Czech Republic, Slovakia, Slovenia, Austria, Poland, Hungary, Germany, Switzerland, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Romania, Ukraine, and Moldova. Now, we've already covered some of these areas and haven't mentioned them much. I think I may have dropped one or two lines about them last week. The reason for this is due to the fact that in the east, in areas like Romania, Ukraine, Moldova, they have a much smaller presence, and they were quickly outgrown and subsumed by the other cultures we've already discussed. So by that fact, you can probably guess it didn't last in every area it arrived in for the same amount of time. I'm mostly going to be focused on what we have found from this culture around the Balkan section of the Middle Danube. Now, the Linear Pottery Culture will be talked about again in more detail in the rest of this season. As we go to these other areas, it'll be mentioned again. I'll go into specific sites there. At least that's my goal. Now, it first emerged around 5,700, 5,500 BC in and around the Middle Danube River, somewhere close to the area where the modern borders of Hungary, Slovakia, Czechia, and Austria are. The people who would be part of this culture were early agricultural pastoralists related to the Starcevo or Koros peoples that we discussed the last episode. And this is the general consensus, at least. There are some other theories, but due to a couple of factors, such as the similarity of their early pottery, some DNA, there's not a lot of DNA samples, but there are a couple of things that kind of do point to that. And there are other artifacts that are also very similar to what you find in the Balkans. And from this origin point, they began to spread up the Danube River, and eventually they reach other European rivers like the Oder, the Vistula. I believe they also get to parts of the Seine River in France. And it should be noted that the linear pottery culture never really makes it to the coast. They get close, and in a couple of places they might have some access to the sea, but this is almost entirely on like the English Channel area, and even then, there is some debate if it's actually the linear pottery peoples that are living there. They're very much an inland people. And prefer to live along the rivers and lakes. Also, and we'll get into the timing on this, but very quickly, there are regional variations that emerge. We will get to the Eastern linear pottery versus the Western linear pottery peoples, but that is also a very early variation in the culture. So you might see it referred to as the linear pottery culture, but almost immediately there are regional variations. And some of those variations do not last long at all, or they emerge because they're already under heavy influence from their neighboring cultures, like the Vinci culture, which we discussed also last week. And of course, they are also influencing mainly the old Europeans, the hunter-gatherer Europeans that are still in various areas. There is evidence of them absorbing, at least genetically speaking, how this is done, if it's done through trade or violence or just good old-fashioned, neighbor marrying neighbor. It's debated, and, it's probably some mixture of all of those. But they do begin to absorb pockets of hunter-gatherers that have been living in Europe far prior to the arrival of agriculture and pastoralists. And there are theories, and again, some of the older ones prior to DNA believe that the Linear Pottery Culture was, in fact, natives, old Europeans who adopted through trade the practices that their neighbors to the south were doing, and then they spread it themselves. Now, again, with the adoption of DNA, that theory is not as strong. However, there is still evidence in some areas where there is very little intermixing, at least until a much later period. So it's possible that, indeed, they did spread this diplomatically, but based on the crops and the animals, this adoption may have just been by fringe groups, and again, they may have spread it to their neighbors, but eventually there is ancestry in all of these places from the Balkans and the early Anatolian farmers moving into Europe. Though, again, I guess you could debate where exactly is that ancestry coming from and when, but by and large, it does appear that this is not a homegrown movement, though there may have been areas where, long-scale old European hunter-gatherers did adopt it independently or just from, learning from their neighbors and trading and that kind of thing. But that's something you see more in the inland areas in Central and Western Europe as opposed to Southern Europe. And, that's probably not surprising given how fast the linear pottery culture spreads. It wouldn't surprise me that, you might have a core of, people of Anatolian farmer descent moving into areas, attracting in or bringing in through force members of these hunter-gatherer groups, and that would only quicken their expansion. It spreads from this area where it initially emerged along the middle Danube. It spreads over, I think it's about 950 miles, which is around 1,500 kilometers, in around 360 years. So they're moving basically in all directions, about 2.5 miles to, which is like 4 kilometers per year. So it's fairly rapid. What they're probably doing is you have, a generation or two, or you have one generation, they move to an area, they set up shop, they have multiple kids, maybe your eldest children, maybe you're passing the land on to them, and their younger siblings are setting up the next village, a couple of miles downstream or uphill or what have you. So they're able to do it very quickly. And again, once you get agriculture in your area, you typically do see populations explode, but there is a period where they kind of reach a population decline for a while. It's not a collapse, but it's just not as spreading as quickly. But this period eventually ends, and then the expansion continues on. And this period lasts about 500 years. The linear pottery culture is broken down into 3 phases, essentially, and each phase, depending on the scholar you're reading, each phase might have like a sub-phase. But you have the earlier period, which is this expansionary period. where you have around 360, 400 years where they're going everywhere. Then you have the middle period where the population kind of hits a standstill or declines slightly. No sites are really abandoned like long term, but you might see a couple of sites come together and form a new location. The people aren't dying, they aren't disappearing, they're not moving very far, but there is a little level of consolidation. And this is the middle period, and that's a couple of hundred years. And then you get to the late period, which is the last 500 years. But we're going to go in a little bit more detail on that when we talk about the other areas. But for now, we'll continue focusing on the Balkans and the Middle Danube region, the home region of the linear pottery culture. Their tools were mostly made of wood and flint inlays, as well as obsidian. They had access to obsidian from nearby mountains, and they would make things like sickles. They used adzes. Most of these were a mix of wood and stone as well. They also did a very good job of polishing stone. There was one very large stone. It's called a mace head. There's really nothing else it could have been used for except as a bludgeoning instrument. Which there goes one of your big peaceful Europe theories. There's no reason to have any kind of weapon like that or tool like that except as a weapon, I should say. Though there are those that argue it could have just been for ceremonial purposes. What that ceremonial purpose could have been for, aside from violence, I don't know. There are those that argue it could have been used to dispatch animals easily. Smash a cow on the skull with it, it would kill the cow. But again, you would kill other animals like humans just more easily even probably than the cattle. But we'll talk about warfare and stuff like that later. They would also use bone. Some of the reconstructions I've seen, their bone tools are typically, I guess, used for a little bit better control or maybe adding a little bit finer detail to wooden objects. They would typically bash these into wood to kind of hollow out holes, drill holes, that kind of thing. But most of the stone tools I've seen are fairly simplistic, used for very specific tasks. They're getting a lot more use out of their flint and obsidian. Their pottery, as you may have guessed, very similar to the Starcevo Koros culture during the period that their ancestors would have conceivably broken away from. They do have lines, as you might have guessed from the name of the culture. These are very broad lines, and they're not necessarily straight. In some cases, they're curved, and these are typically kind of carved into their pottery. They have a little bit more variety in the color of their pottery. They have some gray, they have some black, they kind of have some, it's kind of like an off-white that was probably a little bit more brown when it's just coming out of the earth. And they also have, light brown, dark brown pottery as well. Of course, it's roughly made at first, although not nearly as roughly as some of the other early cultures adopting pottery, which again kind of points to the fact that they're descended from people who know how pottery is made. And it becomes, much smoother fairly early on in the middle period or towards the tail end of their early period. As you get into the middle period, they begin to add more decoration to these lines. They add what is called musical notes to the pottery. Now, these are not obviously musical notes, but they look like kind of the dots on musical notes. And these are done by essentially puncturing into the pottery. Now, they obviously don't go all the way through, but they put sizable dents into the outside of their pots. These are also called strokes. which, that ties into the musical characterization of the decoration, or the musical kind of a description of the pottery. But again, not related to any actual musical formula. They also had seated anthropomorphic figures, much like some of the Starcevo cultures did, although they did not have quite the exaggerated posteriors. These are more simplistic, slightly more realistic looking humans with usually women seated. I think there have been a couple that could be men that they have found, but usually they're thought to be women, and they're just seated. They're just seated with their hands in their lap and kind of a expressionless face. They were also making jewelry, of course. No surprise there. They would make this out of bone. We've found bone combs. We've found bone bracelets and necklaces, as well as pieces of shells that had been broken and had holes kind of drilled into them for, of course, running a string or something like that through them. So we have a lot of different types of jewelry from these peoples as well. They kept cattle, as well as goat, and to a lesser extent sheep. They also kept pigs as well. I think the pigs and the goats are kind of around the same amount, but by far the most important animal they kept were cattle. And this is determined by the amount of bones they have found in trash piles and things like that. They typically practice slash and burn agriculture, not that unusual in the area. They're, of course, by rivers and they're near floodplains, but by and large, they were clearing areas outside of this area. And there was enough rainfall to, that they didn't need to use complex irrigation like you would in some places in, say, Mesopotamia. They mainly grew emmer, einkorn wheat, lentils, and some peas as well. They had other crops that are considered weeds, and these are not grown in nearly the same amount. They probably were wild plants that were, already growing in the area that they kind of saw it didn't really hurt their crops, and could be used to a certain extent for calories, either for themselves or for their animals, or either these are early domesticated strains of crops that would eventually spread in Europe and other areas. Things like barley, broomcorn millet, rye, bitter vetch. We've talked about these in our domestication episodes, but these are not nearly as widespread and grown. They also grew hemp and flax for clothes, cords, rope, what have you. These were grown as well. Oh, also, dogs have been found among the remains of some of the animals, but these are very rarely found. But they are there. They do have dogs, but a question of how many and if they're eating them or using them for companionship. I'm sure some were probably eaten at specific times. If the need was great enough, but by and large, they were very rare in the linear pottery sites. Their homes were very long houses. A typical longhouse might. You can see reconstructions they've built in a few different places in Germany, Austria, things like that. They were, and you'd have about 5 or 6 of these, maybe in a small settlement, kind of butted up to their fields. Each home would have a field or two beside it, and then you'd have a larger kind of area away from the village where there were also crops that probably the whole community tended, whereas the fields maybe beside one house or between a couple of houses would also share a field as well. And I'll remember to put those pictures of them up. But they're very simple wooden support structures inside. They would use wood framing for the walls and the house or the roof, which is kind of a V, an upside down V shaped roof, and they would cover that with thatch. And I'll put a picture of them and also them reconstructing one. There's a photo of that in progress that I can put up as well. Now, unlike some of the other cultures, we have found burials for the linear pottery culture. Now, these are mostly outside of the Balkans, but I do believe that they have discovered some in that area too. They laid their dead down on their sides, kind of with their arms up and their legs kind of done up in like a kneeling position almost, and they buried their dead with ceramics, their jewelry, things like that as well. Now, right around 5,000 BC or so, you begin to see, at least in the Balkans, there's development in this kind of this initial homeland for the linear pottery culture, and you begin to see smaller breakaway cultures or material cultures that developed out of the linear pottery culture, and you don't see them outside of a specific area. Sometimes these are considered part of the broader linear pottery culture. Sometimes you consider them as their own development, but these are people who are, continuing the linear pottery tradition, but also getting outside influences from places like the Vinci cultures. And one of the big breakaways you'll see is known as the Eastern Linear Pottery Culture. This takes place almost entirely within the Pannonian Plain, nestled up to the western side of the Carpathian Mountains in what is now Hungary, Romania, that area. And the area outside of this that still continues aspects of the linear pottery culture is known as the Western Linear Pottery Culture. Though, again, there are, in some cases, regional variations on this, and different places have different names for them, but that's kind of the broad name for all of these cultures. These are essentially the inland Central European, Western European branches of the linear pottery culture. But I'm going to focus mainly on the Eastern linear pottery culture, because that's remaining and developing completely within the area we're discussing. Now, we are not done with the Western linear pottery culture, because we do have to talk about their end, but that will be for a future episode. But their end has some brutality to it, and we'll talk about that more later. Or at least there's a perceived brutality towards the end of the Western linear pottery culture in Central and Western Europe, and again, that'll be for future episodes. Also, before I forget, there is also in a lot of these areas, and some of the places we've discovered last time, a lot of these places, when they are getting ready to build a new building, they will burn down their older ones. This is what creates tails, or what helps create tails. And this is something you see across a lot of these different cultures. And this is also happening in a lot of the places we've discussed the last couple of weeks. So that's something that all of these cultures kind of keep in common, the intentional destruction of their settlements. Though in some cases, there is, again, evidence that some of these locations were not intentionally destroyed, but destroyed for other means. So, did not want to forget that, because I have forgotten to bring it up like the last 3 or 4 weeks. Though I did mention intentional destructions before, I did want to say that this is a widespread phenomenon at a lot of these sites for a lot of these different cultures. Now, to the Eastern linear pottery groups. Now, again, this is kind of an umbrella term that covers several groups that may have had, may not have been strictly Western linear pottery peoples, linear pottery peoples, excuse me. It's a bit of a tongue twister when I try to just rush through it like that. But they were heavily influenced. And you'll kind of see, and I'll either put it up now or I will have already put it up in the YouTube episode, but there's kind of a gap between the Western linear peoples in what is now Moldova, Ukraine, Romania, and the ones in Poland, Germany, and further west. And that eastern group is kind of, again, snuggled up against the Carpathian Mountains along the Pannonian Plain in what is now Hungary and Romania. Now, in the Far East, where, Moldova, Romania, Ukraine is, they have already basically collapsed in those areas. We've already talked about the Cucuteni Tripolie culture, and they absorbed parts of the Western linear pottery peoples. So that has gone away by this point, or at least will have gone away during some point of this season. Even before that, though, the Eastern linear pottery groups are emerging right around 5000 BC or so. And this could be for a number of reasons. And again, we'll talk about it when we talk about the end of the linear pottery culture. But around 5000 BC, things start to go wrong at a lot of their sites. And again, we'll cover that more detail later. But a number of new cultures emerge in that Carpathian Mountain, Pannonian Plain area. Some of these are very closely related to the linear pottery peoples. Some of them are maybe hunter-gatherers who have adopted the lifestyles from the Starcevo and the Vincia and the linear pottery peoples. Excuse me, I keep screwing that up. One of those cultures that is believed to have been kind of a old European adaptation of the linear pottery style is known as the Bükk culture. And these are, again, up in the mountains, the Bükk Mountains of Hungary. And they're right off of the Tisza River and one of its tributaries. And there is a Tisza culture that we'll be discussing here shortly. But it appears that the Bükk are a group of former hunter-gatherers that, through influence from the Starcevo culture and the linear pottery culture, that they've begun to manufacture pottery. They've begun to practice agriculture, to a lesser extent animal husbandry, but primarily agriculture. And there is no evidence that this was a violent imposition onto the Bükk peoples. There's not a lot of evidence of violence at all. So this is probably something that is done through trade. You see, the Bükk are an excellent source of obsidian. There's a lot of obsidian in those mountains. There is evidence that they were setting up workshops to create obsidian or other types of stone artifacts that would have been valued by the Starcevo, the Vincia, the linear pottery culture. That the Bükk culture would have easily been able to trade with them. And of course, being up in the mountains, even if they maybe had wanted to extract these resources by force, mountains are easily defendable. So it's very possible that they, could have been able to fight off any aggressive attempts to take over their land or force them under some kind of aegis by these other cultures. But again, there's no evidence of that. There's also an evidence of a lot of shells and things coming from the Mediterranean, particularly spondylus shells, which is, again, one of the big shells that is useful and very popular for making pottery. But there are other aspects that the Bükk adopted from specifically the linear pottery culture. They have a lot of the same art styles from around 5000 or so, a little bit earlier styles too. But in addition to having the similar art style, the Bükk have a lot more variety in the shapes that their pottery creates. They have very tall standing jars, jars with feet, very large globular bowls, things like that. And this isn't something that you typically see in the linear pottery culture at the period we're talking about. Their pottery is also, the walls on the pots are a lot thinner and more delicate. And they tempered it with sand, which is not something that the linear pottery culture did. They would temper their pots with other resources and material. I think chaff is one. Also, I think chalk was used as well, but I could be misremembering that. But sand is not used by the linear pottery culture. The book did also not use longhouses. They had smaller individual homes. They were rectangular, but they were more for like a small family. They would also, some would be semi-subterranean with the floors built down. Others would be at ground level. But they did, of course, have wattle and daub construction. That's not unusual. That's very common. And they typically had their homes, again, on the hills or up on slopes or sometimes down in ravines as well. And there is evidence that they worshipped or had some type of ceremonial ceremonies taking place in caves nearby. They also buried their dead under their homes, which is not something you see at the other cultures we've talked about recently in the last couple of weeks. So, maybe there's a continuity between the dead and the family living in the home. But it does suggest some type of belief in the afterlife or, the spirit of the dead protecting their family. Also, in addition to hunting deer and things like that, which of course the linear people did, there are also a lot of aurochs bones, wild aurochs bones. So, with all the domesticated cattle along the plains, that's kind of where the wild European bull or cattle have retreated to, up in the hills and the mountains, which the book would hunt. Which is not something you see as commonly in some of those lower lying areas and cultures we've discussed the last few weeks. Now, when the book disappeared, it's hard to get an exact date on it, but there is evidence that they are beginning to mix more with the descendants of the Anatolian farmers moving into Europe, but probably by the middle part of the Copper Age, they are completely gone, or at least 4,000, 3,500, somewhere in that range. Their type of pottery and things like that are completely gone, and they've probably begun to be heavily influenced by the Vinci culture and their successors. Now, the Bükk were a close neighbor, at least geographically, although a little bit of chronologically as well, to the Tisza culture. And now this is located in what is now modern-day Hungary, Western Romania, and the very far eastern end of Slovakia. And it's dated to around 5,400 to about 4,500, 4,400 BC. And very similar to what you would expect. They have a lot of different types of stone tools, adzes, axes, millstones, things like that. They're growing emmer, einkorn, very similar to the economies you've seen of the other cultures. And they were heavily influenced by both the Starcevo and the linear pottery culture. And they're kind of in that broad umbrella of the Eastern linear pottery culture, though they do technically precede them, though only by a couple of hundred years. But by the time of their high water mark, right around 5,000 BC, they've adopted very similar pottery to the linear pottery culture. They have a lot of deep lines on their pottery. They do have a little bit different shapes and things like that. But they have adapted fairly similar humanoid figures, though they do have them kind of in different some different motifs. They're not necessarily having their hands on their legs or their lap. In some cases, they're on their stomach. In some cases, they're holding an item or up around their chest. They also created ceramic altars, which is not something you necessarily see with the linear pottery culture. But they're very heavily influenced by them. And again, for the most part, same type of economy, nothing very different. Their homes were also rectangular, though not as long. They probably were maybe one or two family or a very large nuclear family. There are reconstructions of their homes in Hungary. They would paint the interior with kind of a whitewash, and then they would paint areas of that with red or ochre, kind of giving them different linear or polka dotted designs in some cases. And I'll paint some, or I'll post some pictures of those when talking about them on the YouTube episode. And they're very contemporaneous with the Vinci culture. The Vinci, of course, are probably a breakaway of the Starcevo. So right around the time the Vinci are beginning to phase out the Starcevo in other areas, the Tisza culture is beginning to really come into its own. But they will fall kind of under the influence of both the Vinci and the eastern portion of the linear pottery culture. Oh wow, this it's already at 41 minutes. I don't want to make this too long because I do want to get this edited and up for YouTube as well. So I think that's kind of where we'll call it for this evening. That took a lot longer than I was expecting. But yeah, so what we'll do is next week we'll reconvene, finish off the cultures that I can find English sources on. There's several others that are also kind of in this umbrella that are either regional variations of these bigger cultures or are so tied into local, regional archaeology that it's really hard finding sources on English in. But I'll mention those cultures when we return next week. But just keep in mind that this is not every material culture that is existing in these places. These are just the ones that kind of stand out. Yeah, I think that will be a good place to call it for this week. I do have a new theme song. I'm still talking with the composer. He's gave me a couple options, and they're all kind of similar, and I'm not the best with music, so I asked him a couple of questions. They maybe tried to get a couple of things ironed out with it, but I hope that will be available for next week's episode. I thought I'd have it for this week, but he didn't have enough time to work on it, which is fine. He's given me a pretty good rate for this, so I hope you guys will look forward to that next week. In the meantime, if you have any questions, comments, constructive criticism, please feel free to let me know. You can reach me at waradrevpod@gmail.com. You can contact me via direct message on X/Twitter, or you can comment on the YouTube video for this. And I do occasionally look at comments on the other sites, but they don't always do a great job of notifying me that someone has left a comment, so I sometimes completely miss them. So if you have commented on those other places and I haven't seen it yet, I do apologize. So just let me know one of those other ways if you want to reach out. But please, as I said, rate, download, subscribe, like, leave 5 stars, that kind of thing. I think we're around 354, 355 right now on YouTube. And if you do subscribe to YouTube, I stream there a lot during the week and occasionally on the weekends. If you see I'm live, you're welcome to come by and say hey. You can ask questions there. You can't send me links or anything there. YouTube doesn't allow people to post links in the chat, but you can at least give me the name of an article or something like that, or the author, and I can look it up. I'm also streaming occasionally on Twitch as well. It's October. I'm a big horror movie fan, horror games, that kind of thing. So I'm going to be playing a lot of that. It's not a typical war, history, tactical game, that kind of thing. Not what I'm playing this month. But the rest of the year, I kind of do that a lot. So, again, if you see I'm live, feel free to stop on by, say hey. I appreciate it. And I appreciate you guys listening. To any newcomers, again, please peruse our backlog. And to our returning listeners, as always, thank you guys a lot. It means a lot. It helps make the week go by. But I will go ahead and say good night. I hope you have a good rest of your day / week from whenever you're listening to this. And I will see you all next time. Peace.